is no matter what geography across these regions we were talking about, when we started to say, who is it in this context that is not coming towards the Episcopal Church, that totally shifted the conversation. Because then people in different contexts across the diocese could begin to think about who those particular people were. So if we went to a congregation in one region and we said, who is not coming towards the Episcopal Church here? They could generally give you a profile of who that particular demographic was in their area. And then we could begin to answer all the different kinds of questions about what it would look like for us to design a new kind of ministry to minister to those folks. The other reason why that's really important is because it addresses the anxiety that some congregations can have about sheep stealing, as it were, the common term that we will hear among some congregations. This concern that, well, gosh, if you start a new congregation in our diocese, are they going to be stealing people from my church? Are they going to be drawing away the people that would have otherwise come to our church? And getting really clear that the work of church planting is really to think about how we can reach out to people that otherwise wouldn't be coming to one of our established congregations, helps to address that anxiety that a lot of our congregational leaders can experience. The second important question around who is leadership. It isn't just any leader that is called to be a church planter. And so as you're beginning to think about what kind of who it is that your congregation is called to start a new congregation, a new community with, it's really important to think about, after you've determined who that people group is, for lack of a better term, the secondary thing is, well, what kind of person would be the best leader in this context? As I would hope all of you would be aware of, there is an assessment process that the Genesis team offers. And that is a great way for you as leaders on a diocesan level to get a sense of who is going to have the way that your leaders that might be candidates for church planting, where their strengths lie and where their weaknesses lie. One of the things that I try to talk about in our diocese is that everybody is called to participate in the Missio Dei. All of us are called to participate in God's mission of redemption and reconciliation in the world. But we're all called to use our different experiences and gifts and abilities to go towards that. And some of us will be stronger at being on the front lines and being the people that do the evangelizing and discipling to build a new community. But some people will be good at raising money for that kind of work, or preparing people from a local congregation to come alongside that leader. So designing some kind of an assessment process that lets you get clear as diocesan leaders, or if you're a planter, clear for yourself where your strengths are and where your weaknesses lie, is a really important piece of the puzzle when you begin to think about church planting in your context. The other thing that's important about that is that it lets you get clear on what kind of a team you need. If you have somebody that's really great at evangelistic skill, it's really important to think about what are some of the other skills you're going to need in a particular context to surround that person with. Church planting is a team effort. It's not a Lone Ranger practice. It is not just one dynamic leader out there on their own. It is a group of people with a shared purpose. They've gotten clear on why they're doing this. They know the purpose of this particular project. They're clear on who it is that they're trying to reach in a particular context and with a particular demographic. And getting clear on the different gifts and abilities that are necessary for doing that work is really important. I am not so convinced that it's one particular assessment process that you need to use, but I do recommend that you have a couple different tools for assessment, whether it is sending somebody off to one of the assessment retreats that Genesis offers, or it's drawing from other tools that you can do within your own diocese. I recommend a couple, because just one assessment cannot give us a full view of the leaders that we might be considering. So having a different personality test or something else that can kind of give us a balanced perception of who this leader is and what their strengths will be, what their weaknesses will be, is really an important piece of the puzzle, in my opinion. The next thing that seems to be a really important primary step when determining what kind of church planting work is going to take place in your context is asking the question, what's going to be different if we do this work? What is it that we're measuring in this particular context? There's a lot of anxiety and reluctance oftentimes on measuring things of actually asking for metrics in this kind of work. But that's really an important thing, not so much to determine whether we've passed or failed the work of mission, but so that we can have some benchmarks, so that we can have some estimations of what we think is possible within our context. That's going to be different, whatever part of the country and particular diocese that you're in, based upon the population in a given context, whether it's rural, whether it's in the city, whether it's in the suburbs, depending on the kind of leaders that you have. Some leaders and leadership teams are capable of really growing large communities, and some are really good at drawing together meaningful, nurturing communities that are smaller in scale. But getting clear on what you are aspiring to do is really a really important piece of the puzzle. We get so stuck oftentimes on this question of what and how it's going to, what kind of a community this is going to look like, what kind of music they're going to use, and where they're going to meet, and all those types of things. But when you begin to start with this question of who is it there that is not coming towards the Episcopal Church that we could build Christian community with, when you design the process in that way, it does help with getting clarity on some of these other things of what it will look like, where it will meet, when it is going to meet, etc. A helpful tool, or maybe just a research piece for the idea of metrics and measuring things in different ways, is Gil Rendell's book, Doing the Math on Mission. Gil is a Methodist leader, but it's a short little book, but his book on doing the math of mission is really helpful in thinking about what kind of things we need to be counting and what things we need to be measuring. But in any case, I would also recommend another tool when thinking about what this community is going to look like and what things matter to us that we want to be looking at and asking ourselves whether we're accomplishing those things or not, is the minimum viable community worksheet that was put together by the Community Canvas people. If you just Google Community Canvas is a secular group that has put together a simple worksheet that asks a variety of questions. That some of these are going to be guesses, they're going to be estimates of what you think is possible, but the minimum viable community worksheet that they've put together is a really helpful practice, I think, for you as leaders, as diocesan leaders, and your planting teams to think about what it is that you're actually trying to put together once you have some clarity on who it is that you're being called to build this community for and with. The last thing then is really the question of when. When do you start? When will we know whether this has been successful or not? And one of the things that's really important to remember, I think, when going about new mission projects is that mission moves at the speed of relationships. Be realistic with the estimates of things, but still set timeframes. And here's the reason why: getting clear on what things you're going to be measuring and getting clear on what kind of timeframes you want in place is important. Is that innovation and that kind of scrappiness that we see in a lot of our church planting characters, that works best when there are finite resources and finite timeframes. Creative, innovative leaders need restraints. They need to know that there are only a certain amount of resources and time frame available them to accomplish a particular project. That doesn't mean that it has to be treated as failure if a project doesn't accomplish what you would expect to, whether that be by the things that you're measuring for success or within a particular time frame. What we need to do, especially, and I'm speaking specifically to diocesan leaders and bishops, is we really need to create this type of mission work we need to frame it around being a learning opportunity. Failure is not an option in mission; it's mandatory. Most traditions that are actively engaged in church planting will tell us that church planting has about a 50% success rate. So we need to anticipate that we will not succeed in every case. But that doesn't mean we have to approach failure as defeat. We can approach it as a classroom. It can be something that we can learn from. We can step back and say, okay, gosh, we didn't meet that benchmark or that time frame that we set out there. Why not? What was the context of that? Was it the right person in the right leadership chair? Was it resourced wrong? Was it the wrong context to be trying to do this kind of a community in? But get clear on the things that you are going to measure. Get clear on the timeframes on which you want to at least estimate things to get accomplished in for the particular people that you know are not going to be coming towards the Episcopal Church. And in my experience, those are some of the best conditions for raising the success rates of this type of work. Why don't we take just a little, why don't we take a break from just the talking head bit, for me at least, and let's step back and take a case study, and then we can have a bit of a conversation about that. And I think Jeff Evans was going to be bringing a case study for us to think about all of this in light of. Is that right, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Let's listen to the case study that you've brought, and then we can talk about it in conversation from there based upon the notes that I've brought forward.
Okay, the case study I prepared was St. Dunstan's here in Auburn, Alabama. I'll try to be as clear but as succinct as possible. Auburn, Opelika, Alabama is a community of about 100,000 people. It's grown rapidly over the last 20 years, and it's projected to grow by 50% in the next 25 years. We're in one of the major growth corridors of our state. There was an Episcopal parish that has roots back into the 19th century in downtown Auburn that in the 1950s moved to create more room and make room for a new parish called Holy Trinity, which is where I currently serve. The building that they vacated later became a student center in the 70s and 80s. But there was always a core group of adults who continued to worship there. About 10 years ago, their student ministry started to really dwindle to the point where they had about 30 or 40 adults and about just a small handful of dedicated students. At the same time, the students population, the Episcopal student population, migrated over to our church, and we started a student ministry about 10 years ago. I've been here 6 years, and it's grown since we've been here. When the chaplain of the student center retired a couple years ago, I approached the bishop and offered that we would hire a third clergy person to be the student minister. I noticed around town that the most successful student ministries had somebody dedicated to student ministry that had no administrative requirements, that they could devote their portfolio to student ministry. So we created that, and we're building a thing called Episcopal Student Ministries that does ministry at both St. Dunstan's and Holy Trinity and on campus. And we're building that infrastructure, and that's grown and is doing pretty well. That freed up St. Dunstan's to become a parish, and the bishop was supportive of that idea. The diocese committed to support them for 7 years, with fully supporting a rector for 2 years and then dropping down support every other year for a period of 7 years. They've had an interim rector. They've done a parish profile. They've created a vestry, and I hope they call somebody this summer. And we're trying to support them in prayer and sharing resources and conversation. They just had a vestry election, and 2 of the 3 vestry people were from our church. We're from Holy Trinity, people who've kind of migrated over there, which I think is a great thing. And we're trying to figure out how we support them and how they embrace this vision to kind of be a restarted new church.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So you'll notice by what Jeff shared is that they were clear on who it is that they were trying to reach out to. There was a particular demographic. College students was where the primary conversation was around. There's also there's limits around resources and timeframes. They know they've got this step down process that they're doing with the diocesan funding that's available to them. And so that's a perfect example of really thinking, getting clear on who it is that you're intending to reach out to. And then moving towards some of these other questions about what is it that's going to determine success here? What are the resources that we need to do that? So why don't we switch it from just the talking head and open it up to conversation? Is that okay with you, Katie?
Sorry, I'm nodding, but yes.
Yes,
Absolutely.
awesome. What questions do you all have about church planting in your context that we could address?
So I'll go first. Our diocese has this idea that we would like to plant a church. And the first question that the committee was asked was, where shall we plant it? And what I'm hearing from you is that that's probably a question much further down the list than some other questions. There's a sense at our diocese in terms of history that the first question should be where. Could you comment on difference between location and some of the other questions that you said we should start with?
Sure. Where is not necessarily the worst question to start with, but I do think it leads us to quickly getting to some of the other things. So when we look at where in our particular diocese here in Texas, we start with really kind of a question of who. So where do we not have a density of an Episcopal presence? So is there a part of the diocese where we're seeing an increased population growth in that area, and we don't have any Episcopal congregations near there? So again, that does kind of lead you back to who. So if we see the diocese is growing in a particular area and population in a particular area, or we know it's an area where we do not have an Episcopal presence, that's what drives the conversation about location. I'm not sure exactly where it is on the Episcopal Church's website, but you can access some demographic study information there. You can also obviously go to the US Census and get information, but try to take a deep dive when it comes to location on what the demographics of a particular area are, so that you can get as specific as possible about that. One of the things that can be concerning is when we say, well, let's plant a church here. Well, why? Well, because it's, for example, that's an area that's densely Latino, and we know that Latinos are Catholic, so they should like the Episcopal Church. You want to have that's not always the case, and so we need to have more specific information. And just a quick request: if you're not sharing, you might want to mute yourself if you're not sharing right now, just so that we can all hear each other. Someone's kind of got some loud background noise going on. So I don't think location is the worst thing to start with, but it quickly needs to get specific about the who it is that you're trying to reach out to. I will say, though, I'll go back to my other point about mission moves at the speed of relationships. So I don't recommend just parachuting someone in and anticipating that you're going to have quick results in 12 months. It takes time to build new relationships. It takes time to get to know people and to figure out what's going to work in a particular context. Don't underestimate the importance of a ministry of presence. Someone that's in the community, spending time building relationships, getting to know people, and determining how best to gather a new community in a particular context.
Jason, can I make an observation about John's question or his statement?
Of course.
My concern would be where, John, is that where question coming from in your diocese? It can be, I don't know if it is in your case, sort of a turf protecting question. Where are you going to put this church and how close is it going to be to mine? If that's where it's coming from, then that may not be the place you want to start.
It's a good point, David. Yeah. And again, I think that's why it's important to always approach the conversation about church planting in the context of who is it that's not coming towards the Episcopal Church right now in this particular context. What other questions do you to come to the table with today, friends?
I was there with the Salvation Army guy who I love. He said, you know, their reputation is they have these meetings with you, they ask all these questions of you.
So this is Scott. Can you all hear me?
Stealing.
All right, good. So we have identified mainly through demographic studies and using MapDash where we most need to plant a church based on, access to other Episcopal churches, growing population, that kind of a thing. We've written a grant for that. We even have a potential church planner identified who's already gone very successfully through the discernment process. The next question we're looking at is do we, once he or she starts getting to know the area and talking to people and building those relationships, is it a traditional church plant meeting, a traditional Sunday morning, right to Eucharist with hymns plant, or is it something that is different and edgy and non-traditional and complements the other the more traditional churches in that growing community? For instance, there's already a Lutheran church plant sort of on the other side of that community that looks like it's sort of trying to be a blend of both. So we obviously want to collaborate with them and make sure we're not duplicating, but that's sort of one of the earliest things I think we'll need to look at is it going to be traditional, is it going to be non-traditional, and what does that mean?
Yeah, it's a good question, Scott. I think one of the things we need to be careful of is that being a tradition that is so steeped in tradition, sometimes we can confuse innovation with novelty. And what we don't need is novelty. So I think that that listening to folks in that particular context, and also giving yourself some time to experiment, maybe here and there, give yourself some time frame to pilot some of the different modes of worship that might work. For example, maybe say we're going to try for a quarter worshiping in this style, and see if that seems to generate what we were hoping for, and if not, then pivoting to it in a different way. But I think in my experience, the more we listen to folks in the context, the better conversations we have with people in the particular context, the clearer some of that gets. I will say that generally what we're seeing across traditions is that an interest in more of the ancient traditions and practices of denominations like the Episcopal Church are attractive to younger generations. A lot of studies have been done about that, whether it be Barna or others, but putting them into context, and also bringing about using the gifts of people in context. So for example, one of the most recent church plants that we did here in the Diocese of Texas was by someone that would probably consider themselves pretty Anglo-Catholic. And as they got going, they had aspirations of having a designated worship space and having more traditional accompaniment to their music. And those were just not the gifts that were available to them in their context. Instead, what they got was a bar and someone that could play a guitar. And so they're this hybrid, right? Like they're finding their way into being a hybrid worshiping community where there is elements and aesthetics that would lean more towards an Anglo-Catholic tradition, but also have the gifts and resources of that particular context that are being brought to bear. So the more that our efforts are in dialogue with the gifts and abilities and what's available to us in a particular context, I think the better.
I can throw out too, because I think a lot of times we learn best from mistakes and false assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The Abbey in Birmingham, Alabama is I guess the youngest church plant in the diocese. And it started off, what did you say, Jason? Not innovation versus novelty. Novelty, yeah. There was some novelty aspect to it, right? There was let's start this Episcopal coffee shop because that sounds kind of cool. And in some ways, it really engaged a neighborhood in a way that a traditional church would not have. And you know, I spent many hours there doing a lot of that neighborhood work. And as it matures and grows older and really seeps into that community and has come more to terms with who the who is, it's likely going to transform into something that looks a lot more traditional. It's when the novelty wears off, right? The innovation lasts, but starting to notice that some of the families and children who are coming actually need something that looks more like a traditional community.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, Katie. I think that one of the things we can't underestimate is how long it takes a culture to gel. And I mean by a new community's culture. And that usually is somewhere between the 3 to 5 year time frame. So what that means is that you have about 3 years before a community kind of wakes up and says, oh, this is who we are. This is what our culture is. This is what our values are. This is what defines us as a particular distinct Christian community in this context. And so there is room for, you know, up to 36 months for really trying on what fits in a particular context. But it is usually between that 3 to 5 year time frame when a community really begins to gel and have its own identity. It's at that point oftentimes that a congregation has moved into a semi-permanent space or a permanent space. The leadership is no longer just the planter themselves, but there's a plurality of leaders at that point. There's hopefully a bishop's committee or a vestry or of some sort that's beginning to shape. And so that's just I think a helpful benchmark to have in the back of your mind as you're watching a new community unfold, that it takes years for that to happen. It doesn't happen overnight for a community to kind of crystallize as this is what it means for us to be church in this place.
Jason, just one more comment about what you're talking about. We found in our situation that you're right about the 3 to 5 year time frame in terms of your leadership core becoming more pronounced and more influential, the planter being less the center. What happened with us is that we also, around the 6th or 7th year, we're becoming less rural urban fringe and more suburban. So we had to make another pivot to begin addressing a changing context. We expected it to happen, obviously, but when it did happen, we couldn't anticipate how we were going to have to pivot. So there are other ways that, in addition to what you're talking about, that a new work has to pivot, and that was our experience.
Yeah, that's a good point, David. I think it's also important to consider that the kind of space that a new community is meeting in dictates not just how that community engages with itself, but also the kind of people that will be responsive. So if there is a primary planter, a priest that's been commissioned to do this kind of work, and let's say they start meeting in a family room and gathering people in chairs and sofas in the round, the kind of people that will be responsive to that context are very different than those that will respond to a traditional worship service, whether that be in the neighborhood elementary school or the bar or the community center or a traditional church building. And often that times that can sneak up on both the diocesan leadership and the planter, an individual, a priest planting, or a team. The surprise of that, once you pivot into a different space or the context around you is changing, different kinds of people will respond differently. One of the things that we have noticed is that as soon as a church plant moves into a permanent building that has any kind of aesthetics that reflect a traditional church, that's when traditional Episcopalians begin to show up. And so you can imagine a community that for anywhere from 3 to 5 years has been making new disciples, that is bringing other people that otherwise wouldn't have found their way into the Episcopal Church, Episcopalians, and they are learning how to be Episcopalian in this particular context, who are then joined by people that are all too ready to join the vestry and to run the altar guild, etc. That can be a massive culture shift for a congregation. And so being prepared for the fact that those that are already within the tradition and move into the area, or just kind of hold their breath and wait for the new church to start meeting in a more traditional building with traditional aesthetics and show up, that's a big pivot for the planter and their team, and figuring out how to address that culture shift. And it can be a welcome thing because you'll have people that understand the rhythm and routines of the Episcopal tradition. It also can be a problem if not dealt with and addressed in a healthy way. Other questions?
I have a couple. In our case study, talked about some members. Is it John? I think I might have lost him in my view there, but
Jeff Evans.
Or Jeff, right?
Yeah.
Who migrated over from one congregation to another, and it sounds like that was somewhat organic. But I know that we have places in our diocese where they might have been the sort of mother church, urban core that 120 years ago planted churches outside, but have wondered a bit about a replanting, of the urban center, which I think they've been doing in London and other places. And I just wonder if there's experience out there about that. We're working with something we call minsters, where 2 to 5 churches are working together in a fellowship. And so the idea of a kind of invitation back into a new place. So I wonder if you have thoughts about that. That was a central question of mine.
That's a really fascinating model, Bishop. Could you share with us just how did you pitch that to people?
The minster?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, probably political suicide. Sorry. No. I think in our context in Kansas, there'd been regional work before. It tended to be in more rural, small town, but we could see that our urban suburban places had some real potential for that. Yeah. And we used models both from Britain and from Diocese of Central Pennsylvania. And we're doing a 2-year trial, and we just, got Council of Trustees on board and some important leadership, and rolled it out at convention, and people seem to go with it to try it. So
that's really great. That you model something that's actually really helpful, especially within our tradition, is you drew from the history of your tradition and said, we have done this before. And when there's anxiety around mission, it's often because we don't have an imagination for what that change or that innovation looks like. And so it's often really helpful for us to point to the past and to remind people in our pews, we've done this before. Here's how we did it before. I would partner with that, and you probably did this in some way, shape, or form, is you got, I would imagine, clear on why you did it. Why is this important for us right now? And I think that would be the thing that I would make as clear as possible, is what is our why? And all of us, I would imagine, have been around little kids that they'll ask you a question and you will give them an answer, and they'll say, but why? And you answer that question, and then they say, but why? And that process of answering the why and really getting down to the central core reasons for the rationale for doing this work is really important. So I think those two things, drawing from historical precedent, whether that's on a diocesan level, retelling the stories of how we have planted churches in the past in our history, or drawing from even further back in the Church of England, this is how they've done this, or in another diocese, this is how they've done this, so that people have a sense that this works within our tradition, because I think there's often a little bit of anxiety that what we're really doing is borrowing from somebody else's tradition to do this work. So that's an important piece for giving people an imagination, but getting really clear on our rationale, because the one thing that can be a danger when we're trying to corral people that have already been from either failed churches in a particular context, or we're drawing people from other established churches, is moving towards this work with bad assumptions or bad reasoning for why we're doing this work. We don't want the toxicity of a dying congregation to infect a new work. That doesn't mean that people that were from a congregation that failed shouldn't participate in God's mission. Like I said earlier, everybody's invited to participate in the Missio Dei, but getting clear on how is really an important thing. So, and making sure that people's expectations are clear, making sure that they understand what the purpose of this new project is. Is it just to corral the Episcopalians that are already within a particular context that aren't going to church? I think we can have a higher bar of expectation and anticipation in this work. And so if that's what people are just hoping for, we're hoping that we can do this and not change anything. Like just do things the way we've always done it and just get the few, faithful few in this particular part of town back together on Sunday mornings. Probably not going to work. So the diocese, you bishop, along with other diocesan leaders and planters, you too, you need to be clear on why are we doing this? What is our purpose for doing this? Get as clear and as specific, and I would dare say even as controversial as you can. Make a clear line in the sand about what you're doing and not doing so that people do not have any misconceptions about what this new work is going to be and what its purpose is.
And I'd add to that, a piece of the grant process that the task force has added in this triennium is to have a covenant conversation between the bishop, CFO, and church planter themselves. And a lot of the idea behind that covenant conversation is to ask the why question, and make sure that all those parties who have a stake in this ministry are on the same page about what the vision is and about the answer to the who, and to the why. And, you know, just for example, on wild occasion, I've heard someone say in this congregation, because in 20 years it will have both paid for itself and added this much to the diocesan, you know, apportionment, right? So almost like a franchising why. And then on the other hand, I was on a call today with a bishop and a planter who were both on the same page and very clear that their church planting effort was purely about evangelism, and understanding that a project might never be self-sufficient, if ever. And if you don't set up those common understandings from the front end, it's going to be hard to sort out on the back end.
So if I can share, this is Alan Shin from New York Diocese. We have a replanting project that just happened kind of accidentally, let's say by the grace of the Holy Spirit, really. The process that we have adopted in this incident, I think, is a very important process, and which I would like to share more widely as time goes on. Is that we have it is a replanting a declining congregation, and it's an area called Chelsea in Manhattan, and there's a church that's a fairly historic church. And that's been declining and struggling in the recent couple of decades. And we got to the point where, okay, do we let it die or do we do something about it? It's in a growing neighborhood. So we decided something needs to be done to help them revitalize, and along came a priest who wanted to church plant, and I told her that, well, we have 50 churches in Manhattan, we don't need another new church, but I have a couple of declining churches that need some serious revitalizing, replanting. Let's talk. What happened was that she was an assistant at a larger congregation. And when she announced that she was going to start this new thing, 20 people in her congregation said, we want to go with you. to help you replant this congregation. Of course, it took us about 8 months of preparation work with the existing declining congregation, because of course they were threatened by this whole thing. Our first conversation with the diocesan bishop went southward very quickly, and the first meeting ended with a lot of skepticism from both sides. They were obviously thought that we're getting these new people to take over their church. And they said, why would anybody leave their church to come to this dying church? And so we worked with them, and I worked with them by myself also for several months. And then the new priest, before even she started, worked with the vestry and the wardens for 3 more months. And then the 20 people that she was going to bring with her from this other church, they and the existing declining members of the declining congregation met and had a big party, barbecue party, in which they got to know each other. So what happened was, after about 6 months of doing this, they voted. The vestry and the whole congregation actually voted, because only 15 of them. They actually voted to elect this priest as their priest in charge. And then we did 3 more months of work of preparation, where she continued to spend time with them, and in the meantime also. Other people, not just her leaving ascending church, but other people who are not affiliated with that church heard about it, and they said they want to join this new effort. So we had a launch Sunday, and first Sunday of October last year, 75 people. 15 old members, and then 60 new members, 15 of which were children. And they've continued to grow, actually. And from the get-go, I made it very clear to the existing congregation and to the priest and the new people. I said, we're investing in this fully for the next 6 years, but this is how it's going to work. We're going to pay for the clergy salary fully for 3 years. After that, we're going to decrease it by 25% each year. So 7th year, you better be self-sustaining. That's your goal. So for your own sake, I hope that by 4th year, you are well on the way of paying at least 3/4 of her salary, because then you got a lot of cushion to really grow big time. And they heard me, and I think it's going to happen. I think this is going to work. And now I'm in the process of documenting all of this and duplicating this in several other congregations that need this kind of injection. And this, I think, is a really, really important model for our polity, the Episcopal polity, because especially in our diocese, in order to close a congregation, it takes 3 to 4 years. Bishops do not have the power or the authority, canonical authority, to go in and just close churches. Vestries must vote to close. And that alone, to convince the vestries to vote to close a church, takes 3 to 5 years. And then after that, you let it fallow for 1 or 2 more years. The cost of that, there's no way we can absorb that cost. So this is a model that I think we're going to continue to fine tune, continue to develop. Now, of course, church planting we'll do. We're looking at another church plant, which I think up north in the rural farm area, which I think it'll more like an emerging fresh expressions kind of thing, where I know it's not going to be self-sustaining, but it's okay. That's what it is. and that we're going to support. But that's where we are right now. We're experimenting quite a bit. We've failed a couple already. I learned a lot from that, but I'm excited about sharing some of these models.
That's fantastic, Bishop Shin. Thank you for sharing that story. I love the fact that you're documenting all of this. That takes a lot of the sting out of failure if we're really trying to treat it as something that we can document and learn from each time. But then also to be well documenting what's working so that others can look at that documentation and see, okay, gosh, there's a model here for how we might be able to do this. And if you'll notice what the bishop shared with us, everybody, he started from the get-go with some clear timeframes. There were limits to the amount of resources that were available. They were over a particular amount of time. And that gave people the limits they needed to do the kind of evangelistic innovation, et cetera, they needed to do in order to get to that point where they were self-sustaining. I also think it's interesting that at that point of like 4 years, that's when the point of some clarity began to show up. And we have seen the same thing in the Diocese of Texas. It's usually around that point where a congregation a culture begins to gel, is also usually the point where it becomes incredibly clear whether or not a new community is going in the direction of vitality or not. And that's a point that you can then make those decisions of are we trimming down our resources so that they can be self-sustained? Or are we trimming back our resources here because we're winding this project down, which is okay too in some contexts. So that's great. Thanks for sharing. Katie, I know we only have about 15 minutes left or so. Is there anything else that we need to do to take care of business while we're on, or should we keep going?
Sure. Are there, I would love to talk about the next month's topic, but are there any more just like pressing questions while you've got Jason's wisdom on the line? Good. All right, good. Jason, thank you so much. It's really cool to have someone on these calls who's experienced a broad variety of these different projects, many that have worked out, I'm sure, and some perhaps that haven't. Yeah, and as we journey forward together, I invite you all to add in that wisdom and share some of the experiences. As Bishop Shin and Jeff Evans were also saying, you know, we're continuously learning from each other about what this church planting and redevelopment, and sometimes hybrids of both, mean in this 21st century. Although many things are remaining the same and many things are changing all at once. So I thank you for giving us this time next month, and I don't have the date pulled up in front of me. I've been negligent, but it's the second Tuesday of March, same time, 2 o'clock Central, 3 Eastern. We'll be gathering again. I would love to talk about something that Jason brought up at the very beginning, which is about discerning a call to church planting. And if you're a diocesan leader, really looking at your clergy and lay leaders and knowing how to identify some of the personality quirks sometimes, but also competencies that are really helpful in this work. There is no way to 100% of the time, you know, be assured that you've chosen a person who's going to be successful or plant a successful church. There's about 1,000,001 factors. But one really powerful factor is making sure that the person you're putting into this job is someone who will thrive in it, will be able to have the grit to carry forth under some really challenging circumstances and under the kind of pressure that we've been talking about, whether the time span for funding is 7 years, 3 years, 10 years, and who can do the work of gathering people together into what makes a Christian and faith community. So we will be really drilling into that, looking at a list of those competencies that our Discerning Missional Leadership Retreat Facilitator, Ann Steigerwald, has helped us put together. That are some key competencies for anyone planting churches from any tradition, but also that are especially narrowed in on the Episcopal Church. Anyone have any immediate questions about that? Good. Well, I send you forth into those wet, dreary, hot, cold days that you are all experiencing, and hoping that you will take a lot of this with you and continue letting the Holy Spirit guide you in this work of discernment and planting and revitalizing for the sake of the gospel. Thank you again,